Today on Cryptic Mass Guitar, we do a comparison between the Gibson Les Paul Jr. and the Gibson Les Paul Standard 50s. Alright, so before we get to the sound samples, the spec differences, and how I think they feel different, I always like to talk about something I find very important, which is YouTube videos are fantastic. They help you build excitement, get a different perspective, and you can hear two different guitars up against each other. Albeit that is in someone else's hands with whatever they thought at the time was, fun to play with, amp and setting wise. Please don't use YouTube videos as your sole decision as to why you're buying a guitar. It could look cool in someone else's hands. I don't look cool, but still, it could sound great in someone else's hands, but you could go to the store, you could buy the guitar, and you could find that it doesn't work for you. You don't bond with it. So the best thing to do is go to the store, try that guitar, and then try a whole bunch of other guitars along with it and see which one speaks to you. That's really the best way to do things. So I do have 5 different sound samples for you today. Then we're going to talk about the specs, and then again, talk about how I find these feel and the differences. All right, so there you go. There are the 5 sound sample comparisons between the Gibson Les Paul Jr. and the Gibson Les Paul Standard 50s. Now, one thing to note here with the Standard 50s, this is a AAA flamed maple top. It was a limited edition. Before that, the Flame Edge, as you want to call it, would be a AA. However, they do now have like custom color series where they have boosted the flame on some of the guitars. So just so you know, it's a AAA flame. Let's talk about the specs here, and that'll give you a little bit of information on some of the differences here, because there's one major difference between these guitars. And we'll talk about that right away. So both of these guitars have mahogany bodies. However, the Standard 50s has a carved flame maple top. This is called a slab mahogany body. So basically, if you look at both of these guitars together, this is the back of this without the carved maple top on it. So some people do refer to it as a half a Les Paul. It's rare that you hear that, but I've heard that over the years. And a lot of people, when they look at like things like Explorers, Firebirds, and Flying V's, a lot of times, because it doesn't have a carved maple top and it's a slab mahogany body, they'll usually go, "Oh yeah, look, that's a special junior or special." That's kind of weird. From there, they both have mahogany necks, and they're both the Fat 50s neck carve on them. The Junior has a rosewood fretboard with dot inlays, and it is unbound, whereas the Standard 50s has a rosewood fretboard with the trapezoid inlays, and the neck is bound, which also has the fret nibs. Looking on the front of the headstock, you'll note that the Junior has the silk-screened Gibson logo, as well as the Les Paul Jr. Silk-screened on front, and there is nothing on the truss rod cover. On the front of the Standard 50s, you'll note that we have a inlaid Gibson logo with the silkscreened Les Paul model logo here, and as well the truss rod cover is it says Standard on it. On the back of the headstock, you'll note they both have the same tuners, however the buttons are different. So they're both vintage deluxe tuners made by Gibson, so they're Clouson style. However, this actually has the oval buttons on it, the Junior. They're both not vintage sizing. So if you wanted to swap these out with like locking tuners or a more modern size tuners like, Grovers or what have you, you wouldn't have to remount the holes. They're just interchangeable. You just have to put some pilot holes in the back of your headstock if you're going to Grovers. From there, you want to talk about the bridge. The Les Paul Jr. here has the non-compensated wraparound bridge. So it's not a lightning bar. You're basically looking at it. It's almost like the stop bar, whereas it just wraps around, and there's not really much in the way of adjusting intonation, other than the fact that you can actually move the bridge back and forth on either side to kind of help you out with that. Standard 50s has the ABR1 and the stop bar with it as well. Both of these have CTS audio taper pots with orange drop capacitors. However, there's no toggle switch here because we only have a master tone and a master volume. This has a volume and a tone for each, and we also have a 3-way toggle switch. The Junior has a dog-eared P90, whereas the Standard 50s has a Burstbucker 2 in the bridge and a Burstbucker 1 in the neck. And both of these are non-weight relieved, but clearly this is going to be heavier because there's a lot more hardware to it and a full carved maple top, whereas this doesn't have it. So there's definitely weight differences here, but again, none of these are weight relieved. All right, so that's it for the specs, the similarities and the differences. It's at this point in the video where I like to talk about how they differ, how they feel a little different. Now, both of these have the same body style. However, this is, as some people do say, half a Les Paul, because we don't have the carved maple top to it. Apart from that, the biggest difference is the feel of the bridge. So if you're not used to wraparound bridges, it might take a little bit of getting used to, especially, if you do like moving the saddles back to actually adjust your intonation. But after that point, there's not really much that you have to get used to. There's definitely a different feel to it. I do find that there's a little more vibration with the wraparound bridges as opposed to the two pneumatics and such. But you know, apart from that, they're really great players, and you're not gonna like feel like you're missing out with one or the other. One thing I've always found with the Junior or the Special, as opposed to like a full-size Les Paul or a full thickness Les Paul, I guess you would say, they feel a little pluckier. And then some people kind of get a little confused over what I'm saying. It just seems like there's a little more give to the strings. Whereas this feels like there's a lot more tension to it. So this can feel a little looser than this one, even though they're both at the same, you know, in the same tuning or what have you. Sometimes that really, really works for leads. But what I usually find is if you're playing single notes on the lower strings, it's a lot more evident when you're playing it. Not like a maple neck versus a mahogany neck type situation. But I do find that, especially playing single notes on the lower strings, you do find a little bit more of a noticeable difference. Also, if you put this sucker into D standard, it feels a lot thicker and a lot heavier than this does in D standard. And one thing I didn't do on this comparison video, which a lot of people kind of look for me to do, I didn't find it warranted, and I'm kind of short on time, so I didn't do that as well. I didn't play both of these with metal. You can play this in high gain. Just get a noise gate or a noise suppressor. You're fine. This, because of the P90s, has a lot more punch in it. And there's a lot more variance that you can get when playing with the volume and tone. And that's really where you're going to get yourself into, I'm a better guitar player territory. But don't discount this because it has a P90 for high gain. High gain with P90, especially in a recording scenario as opposed to live, really adds a lot of depth and kind of gives you a little more attack and a little more attitude in your playing. I'd also like to touch on the P90s versus humbucker type situation, because these seem to be underrated a lot in comparison to humbuckers. Yes, humbuckers, you're not going to get a lot of hum going on. They buck the hum. And there's a lot more punch to these. So there's a lot more like high end to them, but it's got this really nice low end that accentuates that high end as well. So that's where a lot of people say it's punchy. But when you're listening, like if you go back and listen to the sound samples, some people have problems hearing differences if you're playing the exact same thing with the exact same settings. But you'll hear, what I've always found is you're going to hear a lot more of the high end in this as opposed to a humbucker. So some people say, it's almost akin to putting like a light blanket over the speaker when you're going from a P90 to a humbucker. You may find that, you may not. But again, you can always adjust your amp settings to kind of accommodate for that. And if your main guitar is a humbucker guitar and then you switch for your secondary guitar for a P90, you probably want to get something like an EQ pedal, or just know what settings works on your amps, because you'll probably want to make those adjustments when going between one or the other, because there's definitely a difference between the two. And again, P90s are highly reactive, I guess you would say, when it comes to volume and tone. That's why this is very important that you have orange drop capacitors, or just something a little better than run-of-the-mill capacitors. Run-of-the-mill capacitors cost like 10 cents. Orange drop capacitors cost $6. Big difference, right? But they just seem to handle the change in tone a little better than like generic capacitors. But P90s are highly reactive to that. So I do find myself quite often using this at like 8 or 9 on volume, and then for the tone, anywhere from, stun, so full blast, from like, 4 to stun. There's just a lot of different combinations that you can get from a Junior. And they seem to hold off a little better than humbuckers. Humbuckers, when you start to roll back the tone, they sound fantastic. However, they're they seem to be a little darker than P90s. So that may work for you, that may not work for you. I find that there's this really sweet jangle, I guess you could say, when you start messing around with the tone and the volume on humbuckers. But these seem to retain clarity, and they clean up a lot nicer than humbuckers as well. And there's always two things that are important when it comes to juniors, because you generally hear two things about juniors. You always hear it's a rocker, and the fact that it's going to make you a better guitar player. Now, I thought, in my infinite wisdom over the years before I got any of the juniors, I thought that I was pretty good with my volume and my tone control. I like to put it in the middle position and roll back the volume and roll back the tone on the neck, and that kind of gives you a much different option for leads and such. So if setting your bridge humbucker to stun and you're playing a lead and it's not really working for you, drag that to the middle position and start messing around with your neck volume. Things sort of clear up, give you a little more low end and stuff like that. But when it comes to a junior, when they say it's going to make you a better guitar player, you're forced to actually discover how to use the volume and the tone a lot better than you have in the past, because with one pickup only being in the bridge, when you want to get that neck or somewhat neck tone, you can't just do it with both of these on full blast. That's when you start dialing back. I've always found the volume at like 9 and the tone sitting at like 4, maybe 3, gives you not a neck tone, but it gives you something that is akin to a neck tone, but still retains a lot of clarity. So a lot of times this really works for recording scenario a little better than just popping a humbucker on the neck position. And I've had a few comments, one especially over the last little bit, where people are asking, hey, if you dial back your volume, I heard that it actually, if you're on like a high gain tone and you dial back your volume, it cleans up. That's true on any guitar. However, and this is what I find funny, someone asked if it was, I heard a rumor that that actually happens on P90 guitars. When you start rolling back your volume, what does generally happen, unless the manufacturer is accommodated for that, I'm talking Fender Strats generally, when you start rolling back your volume, what inherently happens is it sort of muddies up the signal a bit. So you might get a little bit of a duller tone with humbuckers. With P90s, you start dialing it back and you still get that sweet top end. So things clear up, they clean up, and it's still a highly usable signal, whereas the humbucker itself, you might want to start tweaking your amp a little bit. All that being said, and any excuses here, it may sound like I'm making for the junior, or maybe cases that I'm popping in for juniors, because I find that they're overlooked guitars, and I'm still shocked that they discontinued the SG Junior, because that was a fantastic guitar. But if you were to, hold me up and ask me what my preference is between both of these guitars, it's 100% the standard 50s. And that's just because, for me, what I use, the standard 50s, like what I generally play for, I do find the immediacy is a little more enticing for me. And I really do prefer the heavier guitar. And I do prefer the full thickness of a Les Paul. Some people don't like heavier Les Pauls. I'm one that loves them. Anyway, thanks for watching.